The sun beat down on the Badlands like the wrath of an angry god, turning the red dust into waves of shimmering heat that distorted the horizon into something unreal, something nightmarish. Elias Monroe had learned long ago that this land was not made for mercy. Out here, between Wyoming and New Mexico, a man could die a dozen different ways before sunset. Snakebite, thirst, ambush, or simply the slow grinding loneliness that ate at the soul until there was nothing left but an empty husk riding through empty land. Eli was 53 years old, though he looked older. His hair had gone silver at the temples, his face carved deep with lines that spoke of too many winters, sleeping under stars, and too many summers squinting into dust storms. He'd been a family man once, had a wife named Sarah with honey-colored hair, and a boy named Thomas, who just learned to ride when the fever came through their settlement like wildfire. That was 15 years ago. 15 years of watching them cough blood into rags, of holding their hands as they burned up from the inside, of burying them in ground so hard he'd broken 2 shovels digging their graves. After that, Eli stopped being a man and became a ghost. He drifted from ranch to ranch, town to town, never staying long enough for anyone to learn his name or ask about the haunted look in his eyes. He worked cattle drives, mended fences, broke horses, did whatever work paid enough for whiskey and tobacco. He didn't save money because he didn't plan on living long enough to spend it. Every morning, he woke up surprised to still be breathing and a little disappointed. It was late September of 1883 when Eli signed on with a cattle outfit moving 200 head from a ranch outside Cheyenne down to Fort Sumner. The pay was decent, and the trail boss didn't ask questions about the scar tissue on Eli's knuckles or the way he slept with his gun under his bedroll. They were 5 days into the drive, cutting through a narrow canyon in the Badlands, when the shots rang out. The ambush came from the ridge above, at least 4 men, maybe more, their faces wrapped in bandanas. Eli didn't even have time to draw his pistol before the first bullet caught him high in the left shoulder, spinning him sideways in his saddle. The second shot punched into his gut like a fist made of fire, and then he was falling, his horse screaming and rearing as he tumbled backward into empty air. He hit the canyon floor hard enough to knock every thought out of his head. For a long moment, there was nothing but white noise and the taste of copper. Then the pain arrived, a wave of it so intense he couldn't even scream. He tried to move and found he couldn't, tried to breathe and found it took every ounce of will he had just to pull in a thin thread of air. Above him, the shooting continued for another minute, then stopped. He heard voices, rough laughter, the sound of cattle being driven off. The rustlers had gotten what they wanted. They probably thought everyone was dead or dying, and they weren't wrong. Eli could hear someone moaning nearby. Stevens, maybe, or the kid from Laramie they'd hired on in Cheyenne. But the sound got fainter and fainter, and then stopped altogether. Eli lay there as the sun crawled across the sky. The blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the red dust until he couldn't tell where he ended and the earth began. He kept thinking he should try to move, try to find water, try to bandage the wounds, but his body wouldn't obey. It was like his mind had been cut loose from his flesh, floating somewhere above, watching with detached curiosity as Elias Monroe bled out in a nameless canyon in the Badlands. "I'm dying," he whispered to the indifferent sky. His voice came out wet and bubbling. "Ain't no one gonna find me out here. This is it. This is how it ends." Part of him was relieved. 15 years of waking up with the memory of Sarah's last words, "Take care of Tommy," even though he'd failed. 15 years of seeing his son's face in every child he passed. 15 years of wondering why God had let them die and left him alive. Maybe this was justice. Maybe this was mercy. The sun began to set, painting the canyon walls blood red and gold. Eli's vision dimmed at the edges. He could feel his heartbeat slowing, each pulse weaker than the last. The pain was fading now, replaced by a cold numbness that crept up from his feet. This was death, he knew. He'd seen it enough times to recognize the feeling. "Sarah," he breathed. "Tommy, I'm coming." He closed his eyes. Anika Bjornsdottir had learned from a very young age that the world had no place for her. She stood 7 feet and 4 inches tall, with shoulders as broad as most men and hands that could break horseshoes. Her mother had been a Norwegian immigrant, a tall woman herself at 6 feet, who'd fallen in love with a Crow warrior named Soaring Eagle during a brutal winter when he'd saved her from freezing to death. Their union had been unusual enough, a white woman and a native man in the territories, but when Anika was born, it became clear that she was something else entirely, something the world didn't have a name for. She grew and grew. By age 10, she was taller than her father. By 15, she was taller than any man in 3 territories. Her features were a strange blend of her parents, her mother's pale skin and light eyes, her father's high cheekbones, and black hair that fell to her waist in a thick braid. She learned her father's language and his people's ways, learned to track and hunt and read the land. But the Crow looked at her with unease, this giant girl who was half white and all strange. When the fever came and took both her parents, the same fever that had swept through settlements and camps alike, killing without discrimination, Anika had been 17 years old and completely alone. She'd tried to stay with the Crow, but the whispers had grown too loud. "Cursed," they said. "Bad medicine. The giant girl brings misfortune." She'd drifted to a small settlement called Redemption, a scatter of buildings 50 miles from anywhere that mattered. The people there had taken her in because they needed strong backs for hard work, hauling timber, digging wells, breaking land for farming. Anika could do the work of 3 men and didn't complain. She thought maybe, finally, she'd found a place where her strength mattered more than her strangeness. Then the preacher's wife had gotten an idea in her head. "That girl needs a husband," she'd declared, "needs to be settled down proper. Ain't Christian for a woman to live alone like that doing men's work." They'd found a widower named Jacob Henrys, a man pushing 50 with a failing ranch and a drinking problem. He'd needed a wife who could work hard, and the town council had offered him a significant dowry to take Anika off their hands. The arrangement had been made without asking Anika what she wanted. They'd set a date, sewn a wedding dress that took 3 times the normal fabric, and the whole town had prepared for what they were calling the spectacle. The night before the wedding, Anika had put on the white dress and looked at herself in the small mirror in her room. She'd looked ridiculous, like a child playing dress-up in curtains. She was too big, too strange, too much. But she'd told herself that maybe Jacob would be kind. Maybe having a husband would make the town see her as a person instead of a curiosity. The next morning, Jacob Henrys had taken one look at her standing at the altar, had turned the color of old milk, and had run. Just turned and ran, his boots kicking up dust as he fled the church, fled the town, and was never seen in those parts again. The shame had been suffocating. The laughter had been worse. Anika had stood there in her wedding dress in front of the entire town and understood with brutal clarity that she would never be anything but a monster in their eyes. Not a woman, not a person, just a thing to be feared and mocked and used for heavy lifting. She left that same day, still wearing parts of the torn wedding dress under her regular clothes, and had walked into the Badlands until she'd found an abandoned line shack built into a cliff face. It was small for her. She had to duck to get through the door, but it was hers. No one to stare, no one to whisper, just the wind and the silence and the endless empty land. That had been 3 years ago. Anika was 24 now, and she'd learned to survive alone. She hunted rabbit and deer, trapped rainwater, gathered the tough desert plants her father had taught her were edible. She avoided redemption and anywhere else people gathered. She'd become a legend in the territory. The giant bride, they called her, a cautionary tale mothers used to frighten children. Some said she'd gone mad and ate human flesh. Others said she was a witch who could curse a man with a look. The truth was much simpler and much sadder. She was just a lonely woman trying to survive in a world that had no place for her. It was a late September evening when Anika went looking for water. The creek that fed her shack had been running low, and she'd heard the sound of gunfire earlier in the day. Not unusual in these parts, but it had spooked the game. She'd followed a dry wash deeper into the Badlands, looking for a spring she remembered from years ago, when she'd seen the buzzards circling. Buzzards meant death. Usually she avoided such places. Death attracted predators. And even Anika was wary of mountain lions and bears. But something made her change direction, made her climb the rocky slope toward the canyon where the birds were gathering. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was loneliness making her reckless. Maybe it was fate. She found the bodies as the sun was setting. 3 men, all dead, lying in various positions of violent end. The cattle were gone. This had been a rustler attack, she realized. Seen too many of them in her time to mistake it. She was about to turn away when she saw the trail of blood leading over the edge of the canyon. Anika peered down and saw him, a man, crumpled at the bottom of a 15-foot drop, lying in a dark pool that had to be blood. He wasn't moving. The buzzards hadn't found him yet down there in the shadows, but they would soon. She should have left him. That would have been the smart thing, the safe thing. Dead cowboys were none of her business. But as she stood there, the wind picking up and carrying the smell of blood and dust, she heard it, a sound so soft she almost missed it. A whisper, a word. Please. He was alive, barely, but alive. Anika made her way down the canyon wall with the ease of someone who'd spent half her life climbing rocks. Up close, she could see he was older, maybe in his 50s, with silver in his hair and 2 bullet wounds that should have killed him already. His eyes were closed, his breathing so shallow, his chest barely moved. She knelt beside him. A strange reversal, this giant woman kneeling to tend a dying man. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they focused on her face. She saw the fear and confusion there, the way his mind tried to process what he was seeing. Please, he whispered again, his voice like dry leaves. Leave me. I ain't worth saving. Let me go. The words hit Anika harder than she'd expected. Here was a man begging for death, and she understood that plea in her bones. How many times had she thought the same thing? How many nights had she wondered if it wouldn't be easier to just walk into the desert and not come back? But looking at him, broken and bleeding in the dust, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe she couldn't save herself from the world's cruelty, but she could save him. "No," she said, her voice deep and rough from disuse. "Not today, not you." She lifted him as gently as she could, cradling his body against her chest the way a mother might hold a child. He weighed nothing to her. 160 pounds was a sack of grain, was a deer carcass, was nothing at all. She could feel his blood soaking into her shirt, feel the broken rasp of his breathing. He was dying, she knew, but not if she had anything to say about it. The walk back to her shack took 3 hours. Anika moved as fast as she dared, but she couldn't run, couldn't risk jostling him too much and making the bleeding worse. The moon rose full and bright, turning the Badlands into a landscape of silver and shadow. She talked to him as she walked, a constant stream of words in a language he probably didn't understand. Crow words her father had taught her, prayers and songs meant to keep the spirit tethered to the body. By the time she reached the shack, the man had lost consciousness again. Anika kicked the door open. It was too small for her to carry him through normally, and laid him on her bed, the only piece of real furniture she owned. Then she got to work. Her father had taught her the healing arts of the crow, how to read wounds, how to stop bleeding, which plants could fight infection, and which could ease pain. She'd learned from her mother, too, Norwegian folk remedies passed down through generations. She used all of it now, working through the night by the light of a single lantern. The shoulder wound was bad but clean. The bullet had gone straight through. She packed it with a paste made from yarrow and prairie sage, then bound it tight. The gut shot was worse, much worse. The bullet was still inside, lodged somewhere near his liver. She knew she had to get it out, or infection would kill him within days. She heated her knife in the fire until it glowed, poured whiskey over the wound, and began to dig. The man screamed, a raw animal sound that tore at her heart, but didn't wake. His body convulsed, trying to escape the pain even in unconsciousness. Anika held him down with one hand, easy, so easy, like holding down a child, while the other worked the knife deeper. She found the bullet lodged against his 10th rib. Another inch, and it would have hit something vital. She pulled it free, cauterized the wound, and stitched him closed with thread made from deer sinew. By the time she finished, the first light of dawn was creeping through the cracks in the walls. For 3 days, the man burned with fever. Anika kept him cool with wet cloths, forced water and medicinal teas down his throat. When he was conscious enough to swallow, and prayed to her father's gods and her mother's God that he would survive. She barely slept, dozing in a chair beside the bed, waking at every sound he made. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. She woke to find him staring at her with clear eyes for the first time. "Where?" he started, his voice cracked and dry. "What? You're safe," Anika said quietly. "You were shot. I found you." His eyes traveled over her face, her shoulders, taking in her size. She waited for the fear, the disgust, the horror. It always came. Instead, he said, "Thank you." And then he closed his eyes and slept, truly slept, for the first time since she'd found him. Eli woke properly on the 4th day. The pain was still there, a deep ache in his shoulder and a burning in his gut that flared with every breath. but it was manageable. He was alive, which was both surprising and disappointing in equal measure. The shack was small and dim, lit by sunlight streaming through gaps in the wooden walls. He could see rough furniture, bundles of dried plants hanging from the rafters, a small fire crackling in a stone hearth. And sitting in a chair that looked comically small beneath her, watching him with cautious eyes, was the woman who'd saved him. No, not a woman, a giant. Eli had seen tall people before, but nothing like this. She had to be over 7 feet tall, with shoulders broader than most men he'd worked alongside. Her face was striking. Pale skin, high cheekbones, eyes the color of winter sky. Her hair was black and long, braided in the style of the Plains tribes. "How long?" he asked. "4 days," she replied. Her voice was deep but gentle, like distant thunder. "The others?" "Dead. You were the only one still alive when I found you." Eli nodded slowly. Stevens, the kid from Laramie, old Garcia who'd been planning to retire after this drive, all gone. He should feel something about that, he knew. Grief, anger, something. But there was just the familiar numbness, the same emptiness that had lived in his chest for 15 years. "Why?" he asked. She blinked. "Why what?" "Why save me? Would have been easier to let me die." Something flickered across her face. Pain, recognition, understanding. "Maybe, but I didn't want to." Over the next week, as Eli slowly regained his strength, he learned her story in pieces. She didn't talk much, seemed unaccustomed to conversation, but when she did, her words were careful and precise. She told him about her parents, about growing up caught between two worlds and belonging to neither. She told him about redemption, about the wedding that wasn't, about becoming the legend of the giant bride. She didn't tell him about the loneliness, but Eli could read it in every line of her body, in the way she flinched when he made sudden movements, in the way she seemed surprised every time he thanked her for something. He recognized it because he wore the same loneliness, like a second skin. "They called you a monster," he said one evening as she was changing his bandages. It wasn't a question. Her hands stilled. "Yes." "They're idiots," Eli said flatly. "You saved my life, carried me 8 miles through the Badlands, dug a bullet out of my gut, and sat with me for 3 days while I burned with fever. I've known a lot of people in my time, and most of them wouldn't have crossed the street to spit on me if I was on fire. You're the furthest thing from a monster I've ever met." She looked at him with such raw hope and disbelief that Eli felt something crack in his chest, some piece of the armor he'd built around his heart after Sarah and Tommy died. "Thank you," she whispered. As the days passed and Eli grew stronger, they fell into a routine. She would hunt and gather, while he was too weak to move much. He would tend the fire, prepare what food she brought back, mend tears in their clothes. They talked more, trading stories of their pasts like precious coins. He told her about Sarah and Tommy, about the fever, about the 15 years of drifting that followed. She told him about her father teaching her to track, about her mother's songs, about the crushing weight of never fitting anywhere. One morning, 3 weeks after she'd found him, Eli announced he was going to check her roof. "You're still healing," Anika protested. "You shouldn't." "I'm well enough to climb a ladder," he interrupted, "and your roof's got holes that are going to be a real problem come winter. Let me do this. I need to do something useful." She relented, and he spent the day patching the worst spots with materials he scavenged from around the shack. It felt good to work, to use his hands for something constructive. When he came down at sunset, Anika was standing there with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said. "You saved my life," Eli replied. "Least I can do is keep the rain off your head." Something changed between them after that. Eli started taking on more tasks, repairing the fence she used for her small garden, fixing a broken chair, improving the fireplace so it drew better. Anika taught him the plants her father had shown her, the ones that could be eaten or used for medicine, and showed him the places where water collected after rains. They rode together, her on the only horse she had, him sitting behind her because his injuries still made mounting difficult, both of them laughing at the absurdity of it. They were two broken pieces of humanity, Eli realized, finding that they fit together in ways that made them both a little more whole. It was during one of their rides, 6 weeks after she'd found him, that things shifted again. They'd stopped to water the horse at a spring, and Anika had been unusually quiet all morning. "What's wrong?" Eli asked finally. She was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Why do people hate me? What did I do wrong?" Eli looked at her, this strong, kind, impossibly brave woman who'd saved his life and asked for nothing in return, and felt anger kindle in his chest. "You didn't do anything wrong. The world's full of small-minded fools who fear anything different from them. They looked at you and saw something that challenged their tiny understanding of how things should be, so they called you a monster, because it was easier than admitting their own ignorance." "But I am different," she said. "I'm too big, too strong, too—" "You're perfect exactly as you are," Eli interrupted. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers disappearing in her palm. "The world's blind, Anika, but I ain't. I see you." She looked at him with tears in her eyes, and Eli knew with absolute certainty that he was in love with her. It didn't matter that she was half his age, or that she was so much larger than him, or that society would call it unnatural. Sarah had been dead for 15 years, and his heart had been dead just as long. But here, in this impossible place with this impossible woman, he'd found a reason to keep breathing. "I see you too," she whispered. They became lovers that night in the small shack with the patched roof, and it was tender and awkward and beautiful. Anika was terrified of hurting him with her strength, and Eli had to teach her that he wasn't made of glass. But they learned each other slowly, carefully, with the patience of two people who'd been alone too long to rush. The next months were the happiest of Eli's life since before the fever. He and Anika built a life together in that shack at the edge of the world. They expanded the cabin, adding a second room and a real door that Anika could walk through without ducking. They built a small corral and bought 2 more horses from a rancher 50 miles away who didn't ask questions. They hunted together, worked together, slept tangled in each other's arms through the cold winter nights. Eli taught Anika to play poker and lost consistently because she could read his tells too easily. She taught him words in Crow and Norwegian, laughed when he butchered the pronunciation. They were happy in a way that seemed impossible, stolen happiness in a world that wanted to deny them even that. But happiness never lasts, not for people like them. It was spring when the riders came from Redemption. They'd been in town for supplies, a rare trip they made only when necessary, always cautious, always watching for trouble. They'd kept their heads down, bought what they needed, and were riding out when someone recognized Anika "That's her!" a woman's voice shrieked. "That's the giant! She's got a man with her! She's probably hexed him!" They'd run then, spurred their horses, and fled into the Badlands with angry voices rising behind them. They thought they'd lost the mob. But 3 days later, as evening fell, they saw the dust cloud on the horizon. "They're coming," Anika said, her voice hollow. "How many?" Eli asked, already checking his guns. "Too many?" They came at sunset, 20 men from Redemption and the surrounding ranches armed with rifles and torches and righteous fury. They surrounded the shack, their leader, a man named Carson, who ran the general store, calling out in a voice tight with fear, disguised as anger. "We know you're in there, monster. Send out the cowboy. We're here to save him from you." Eli stepped out first, his shoulder still aching, but his gun hand steady. "I don't need saving. I'm exactly where I want to be." "She's hexed you," Carson shouted. "Everyone knows that thing ain't natural. She's probably planning to kill you, eat you maybe. We heard stories." "You heard lies," Eli interrupted, his voice cold as winter wind. "That woman saved my life when I was bleeding out in a canyon. She carried me 8 miles, dug a bullet out of my gut, and sat with me for days while I hovered at death's door. She's shown me more kindness than any so-called civilized person has in 15 years. So you can take your stories and your torches and your fear, and you can get the hell off our land." "She's a monster," someone in the crowd yelled. "No," Eli said quietly. "You are." That's when someone fired. The shot went wide, but it was enough to break the standoff. Eli fired back, and suddenly everyone was shooting, muzzle flashes lighting up the twilight like lightning. Eli dropped behind cover, returning fire as methodically as he could, but they were badly outnumbered. Then Anika stepped out of the shack. She was unarmed, standing at her full height, and in the dying light she looked like something out of legend. A Valkyrie, a goddess, an angel of judgment. For a moment everyone stopped shooting, stunned into silence by the sheer, impossible presence of her. "Stop!" she roared, her voice carrying across the compound. "I am not your enemy. I have done nothing to any of you except exist. If that is my crime, then punish me, but leave him alone." "Get back inside," Eli shouted at her. She ignored him, walking forward with her arms spread, making herself a target. "I am unarmed. I am alone. If you must kill someone to satisfy your fear, then kill me, but let him go." "No." Eli scrambled out from cover, running toward her. That's when the second shot came. Time seemed to slow. Eli saw the muzzle flash, saw the bullet cross the distance between the shooter and Anika, saw her body jerk as it hit her high in the chest. She stumbled, her hand going to the wound, blood welling between her fingers. "Anika!" Eli caught her as she fell, or tried to. She was so heavy, he went down with her, both of them collapsing to the dust. The shooting had stopped again. Everyone was staring at the giant woman bleeding in a cowboy's arms, and for the first time, maybe they were seeing what Eli had seen all along, not a monster, but a person who was dying because of their fear. "Help!" Eli screamed at them. "Someone help! Get a doctor!" But no one moved. They just stood there, frozen, as if they couldn't quite believe what they'd done. Eli looked down at Anika. Her eyes were open, looking at him with an expression of terrible sadness. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't," he said, pressing his hand over the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, even though he knew it was too much. "Don't you dare apologize. You did nothing wrong. Nothing. You hear me?" "At least," she coughed, blood on her lips. At least I got to know what it felt like to be loved. You are loved, Eli said, tears streaming down his face. You are so loved, Anika. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. You brought me back to life. Don't leave me. Please don't leave me. She reached up with one trembling hand and touched his face. Thank you for seeing me. And then she died, her hand falling away, her eyes going empty and fixed on the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. For a long moment, Eli just knelt there, holding her, rocking back and forth like a child with a broken toy. Around him, the men from Redemption began to shuffle, uncertain, some looking ashamed, others defiant. Then Eli looked up, and the expression on his face made several of them take an involuntary step back. "Get out," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying in the silence. "Now listen here," Carson started. "Get out!" Eli roared, and this time they listened. They mounted their horses and rode away into the gathering dark, leaving Eli alone with the body of the only person who'd made him want to live. They found Elias Monroe 3 days later. He'd dug a grave on the ridge above the shack, a grave deep enough and wide enough for Anika's body. He'd lined it with wildflowers and river stones, and he'd carved her name into a piece of wood he'd erected as a marker. And then he'd put a bullet through his own heart and laid down beside her grave, his hand stretched out as if he could touch her one more time. The doctor they'd finally sent from Redemption, too late, always too late, examined the scene and shook his head. "This was murder," he said quietly to the sheriff who'd come with him. "That woman was killed by people from our town, and this man died of grief." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, looking at the 2 graves, one filled, one waiting. "We'll tell people he was crazy," he said finally, "that the giant had hexed him like they said. Better that way." "Better for who?" the doctor asked bitterly. The sheriff didn't answer. They buried Eli beside Anika in the grave he'd prepared for himself. The shack fell into ruin over the following years, the desert slowly reclaiming it. But the story spread, twisted and changed in the telling, as stories do, until it became a legend told around campfires and in saloons. Some said the ghost of the giant bride still walked the Badlands, carrying a silver-haired cowboy in her arms, searching for a place in the world that would accept them. Others said, if you went to that ridge on certain nights, when the moon was full and the wind was right, you could hear 2 voices, one deep as thunder, one rough as sandpaper, laughing together in the darkness. But the truth was simpler and sadder than any legend. 2 people who'd been rejected by the world had found each other in the loneliest place imaginable. They'd built something beautiful from their brokenness, something pure and true, and the world, in its infinite cruelty and endless fear of the different, had destroyed it. The Badlands kept their secret. The desert winds scattered the flowers from Anika's grave and weathered the marker Eli had carved. Time passed, as it always does, and the story became just another piece of Western mythology, tragic and romantic and not quite real. But for one brief, shining moment, in a shack at the edge of nowhere, a dying cowboy and an abandoned giant bride had found in each other something the rest of the world could never give them. They'd found home. 50 years later, a young woman from the university in Denver came to the Badlands doing research on frontier legends. An old rancher told her about the giant bride and the cowboy, about the shack that used to stand on the ridge, about the two graves that had long since been lost to erosion. "You believe it?" the researcher asked skeptically. The old man shrugged. "Don't matter if I believe it, but I'll tell you this. My granddaddy was one of the men who rode out that night. He never spoke about it much, but before he died, he told me something. Said he'd seen the way that cowboy looked at that woman, and the way she'd walked into those bullets to save him. Said in all his years, he'd never seen two people love each other that pure, that true. Said it haunted him till his dying day, knowing he'd been part of killing something beautiful, because he was too scared to understand it." "That's sad," the researcher said. "Yeah," the old man agreed, looking out at the Badlands stretching to the horizon. "But maybe there's hope in it, too. They found each other, didn't they? In all that emptiness, against all those odds. That counts for something." The researcher nodded and wrote it down in her notebook, another piece of the puzzle that was the Old West. She never did find the graves. The desert had taken them back, as it takes everything eventually. But she published her research, and the story lived on passed from generation to generation, changing a little each time it was told. And maybe, in some way, Eli and Anika lived on too, not as legends or ghost stories, but as a reminder that love can exist in the most unlikely places, that humanity can be found in those society deems inhuman, that sometimes the monsters aren't the ones who look different. Sometimes the monsters are the ones who can't see past their own fear long enough to recognize the beauty standing right in front of them. In the Badlands, where the wind never stops and the red dust paints everything the color of blood and rust, the story of a dying cowboy and the giant bride who saved him became just another whisper in the wilderness. But for those who listened carefully, who let themselves hear beyond the legend to the truth beneath, it was a story about the most powerful force in any frontier, the stubborn, reckless, world-defying courage it takes to love someone the world says you shouldn't. And that kind of love, even when it ends in tragedy, even when the world crushes it beneath its heel, never truly dies. It echoes.